A suitcase. Old. Damaged. Hidden for years. And inside were things that should have never been there. By spring of 1976, the most active phase of the investigation was winding down. Not by choice. By exhaustion. Of leads. Of resources. Of the peculiar kind of hope that sustains investigations in their early weeks. The FBI's involvement was reduced. Marsh was reassigned to other cases, though he kept the Hartwell file in a box in his office and returned to it periodically, reading the same reports in the hope that some new order might emerge from the same old facts. It didn't. And somewhere outside the park, somewhere in the wider world that Annie Hartwell had been carried into, the trails simply end. The rooms we don't change. Time is the cruelest element of a case like this. Not because it passes. It always passes, for everyone, and everyone learns to live inside its passage. The cruelty is more specific than that. The cruelty is what time does to hope. How it doesn't kill it all at once but wears at it, steadily, the way water wears at stone, until one day you look at what's left and realize that hope has become something else. Something quieter. Something that lives in a different room than the one you keep your ordinary life in. Robert and Patricia Hartwell went on living. They had no choice. The world is very insistent about that. Robert returned to work in the fall of 1975, 3 months after Annie's disappearance. He went back to his desk and his files and his ordinary insurance adjuster's life because there was nothing else to do. The searching was being done by people more equipped to do it. His being at home, staring at walls, accomplished nothing except to consume him. Work was a structure. What kept him upright? Patricia did not return to the florist shop. She could not, she said. The flowers undid her. Everything that was bright and sweet and small undid her. She took a job instead at a local library, drawn to the quiet, to the stillness, to a place where people came seeking something and left with it, where things had their proper places and stayed in them. She kept Annie's room exactly as it was. Not as a shrine, Patricia would insist when people asked. And people always asked, eventually, with that particular careful gentleness of those wanting to understand grief they couldn't quite imagine. Not a shrine, just unchanged. Because change felt like a decision, and she wasn't ready to make that decision. And the ceramic animals on the shelf above the bed needed to be in their proper order, because Annie had arranged them that way. And who was Patricia to undo that arrangement? The birthdays were the hardest. Every May 14th, the calendar turned over to a number, 7, then 8, 9, 10, that belonged to Annie but could no longer be measured against a real child. Patricia baked a cake anyway, for the first 3 years. Then she stopped, because the cakes felt wrong, and she let the day pass like any other, which also felt wrong, but less sharply. The missing posters had their own life cycle. They went up everywhere in the fall of 1975, on telephone poles and bulletin boards and in the windows of gas stations and grocery stores across Southern California. They were vibrant at first. Fresh paper, clear ink, Annie's laughing face sharp and precise. Then the sun did its work. The ink faded. The paper yellowed. By 1977, most of the posters had been papered over by newer notices, the natural turnover of community bulletin boards asserting itself indifferently. Marsh called once a month for the first 2 years, then once every 2 or 3 months. He never had new information. He called because he thought it was right that he call, that a family should not be left with silence as their only correspondence from the people who were supposed to be finding answers. He asked how they were. Patricia would tell him they were managing. Robert would get on the line and ask, every time, whether there was anything new. Marsh would tell him no, but that the file remained open. The file remained open for 15 years. Officially, the case was never closed. A missing child is always officially unsolved until the child is found. But in the practical language of police departments, where resources are finite and cold cases compete with pressing ones, the Annie Hartwell investigation had been, by the early 1980s, effectively inactive. Sitting in a filing cabinet, visited occasionally, essentially still. In 1982, Robert had a small breakdown. Nothing dramatic, no hospitals, no scenes. More like a long, slow deflation that his doctor recognized and responded to with medication and a referral to a therapist. The therapist helped. Robert would say, years later, that the therapy helped him understand that what he was experiencing was not weakness. It was the delayed, cumulative effect of living for 7 years with a wound that had never been allowed to heal because healing felt like betrayal. He and Patricia stayed together. This surprised some people who knew them, who had heard the statistics about couples who lose children and the marriages that don't survive it. But they stayed, because the loss was their shared language now, and separating would have meant losing the only person in the world who understood every sentence you spoke without explanation. They never had another child. By 1985, 10 years after Annie's disappearance, Patricia began to allow herself, occasionally, to use the past tense. Not about Annie, never about Annie, but about the investigation, about the searching. She began to say, carefully, that she did not expect to find answers now, that she had made a certain peace, not with what had happened, never that, but with the not knowing. She said it was something she carried, not something she was under. Robert couldn't quite get there. He still called Marsh twice a year. Marsh had retired from the department in 1983, but he kept the number, and he always answered when Robert called. They had developed a strange, tender friendship across the years, two men connected by the worst thing, who called each other and talked around it and occasionally, very carefully, talked directly about it. "Do you still think about it?" Robert asked once, in one of those late-night phone calls. "Every day," Marsh said. "I think about it every day." "What do you think happened?" A long silence. "I think someone planned it very carefully," Marsh said. "And I think they got away with it, for a while. But I have lived long enough to know that things have a way of surfacing. People talk. Objects get found. Earth gives things up." He paused. "I'm not ready to stop believing that." He said this in the spring of 1990. 6 months later, the rains came to Southern California. What the Earth remembered. Al Denton called the Anaheim Police Department at 7:45 in the morning of October 23, 1990. The officer who took the call was a young woman named Detective Sandra Perez, 18 months on the job, who was processing routine calls that morning when an older man with a slow, careful voice said that he had found something on his property after the floods, and that he thought someone should come and look at it. Perez had responded to flood-related calls before. People found things after floods. Usually it was debris. Sometimes it was property damage claims masquerading as police matters. She had learned to listen carefully to the voice more than the words, to the quality of certainty or uncertainty in how someone described what they'd seen. Al Denton's voice was certain, quiet and certain, the way people sound when they aren't trying to make something into more than it is, but they know what they saw. She drove out to the farm with her partner, Detective Roy Ullman. The suitcase was still where Al had left it, near the culvert at the eastern edge of the lower field. He had replaced the lid carefully after looking inside, and he had not touched anything within it, and he had walked back to the house in his squelching boots and waited with his coffee going cold on the kitchen table until the police arrived. He was that kind of man. Perez and Ullman approached the suitcase with proper procedure. Photographs first, scene documentation, gloves. They opened the lid. They looked inside. The clothes were the first thing, compressed and waterlogged, the colors muted by water and time but not entirely gone. A dress, once red. The fabric was degraded, rotted at the edges, but the color remained in the center folds where moisture and earth had preserved it, the way things are sometimes preserved under pressure, against all logic. A child's dress. Small, very small. A shoe. White. Once. Patent leather. Now cracked and gray with age and mud. A single shoe. The left. Size 5 or 6. A small photograph. Warped beyond legibility. The image was almost entirely gone. dissolved by water and time into a pale blur. But the photograph itself, the physical object, could be processed. And then, beneath all of it, pressed into the bottom of the case by the weight of everything above it, the mask, white painted, clown features, a wide, red-painted mouth curved upward at the corners in an expression that bore no relationship to any actual human emotion. Too wide, too symmetrical, too fixed. Large dark circles around the eyes. Red at the nose. Water had damaged it. The paint had cracked and bubbled in places. The material had warped. But it was intact. Ullman photographed it from every angle. "What is that?" he asked. And the question was partly professional and partly simply human, the disoriented response of a person encountering something that exists at the intersection of the playful and the deeply, fundamentally wrong. Perez was already on the radio. Within 2 hours, detectives from the Major Crimes Division were on site. By early afternoon, the field had been cordoned off. A forensic team had begun the systematic process of gridding and searching the surrounding area. Ground-penetrating radar equipment arrived the following morning. What the radar found in the earth near the culvert, in an area that, when the flood surface deposits were cleared away, showed evidence of old disturbance, was examined over the next several weeks with a full weight of the resources that the Anaheim Police Department could bring to bear. In the meantime, someone on the investigative team, a detective with a long memory for old case files, had begun pulling records. He was sitting at his desk on the third evening after the discovery, looking at the inventory of items from the suitcase, when something snagged. He pulled an older file. He read it. He read it again. He went and found Perez. "There's a case," he said. 1975. A missing girl. Annie Hartwell. She was 6 years old. Brown hair. 2 braids. He paused. She was wearing a red dress and white patent leather shoes when she disappeared. Perez stared at him. "She went missing from Disneyland," he said. July 19th, 1975. He put a photograph on her desk. Annie on the carousel. Head back. Braids flying. Laughing. And in the witness accounts from that investigation, he said, there are 2 separate descriptions of an individual scene with a child near Fantasyland. He opened the file to the relevant section, wearing a clown mask, white, with a painted red mouth. The room was very quiet. "The mask in that suitcase," Perez said slowly, "needs to be compared," the detective said. "But yes." The man in the crowd. The reopened investigation moved with a different kind of energy than the original one. 15 years had passed. The urgency was not of the immediate, frantic kind. There was no longer a living child to find. What the investigation now sought was different. Identity, confirmation, truth. The kind of truth that exists not to bring someone home, but to close the distance between a family's not knowing and a reckoning with what had actually happened. These are different urgencies, and they require different kinds of patience. The forensic examination of the suitcase and its contents took several weeks. Some findings could be confirmed. Some could not. The dress was consistent, in size and era and construction, with children's clothing manufactured in the early 1970s. The fabric type, the construction of the collar, all of it placed the garment in the right period. The shoe was a size 6, consistent with the feet of a 6 to 7-year-old child. The photograph could not be restored. It had dissolved too completely. But the photograph itself, the paper, the coating, was consistent with photographic stock from the early to mid-1970s. The mask was consistent with a description provided by Donna Wexler, the 8-year-old witness, in October 1975. The forensic team, working with Donna's original composite sketch and her own recollections, she was now 23, a college graduate living in Seattle, and she was contacted by investigators and asked to review the mask, confirm the resemblance. She could not say with absolute certainty that it was the same mask, but she said, quietly and clearly, "That's what I saw. That's what he was wearing." The land itself told part of the story. The property where Earl Denton farmed had changed hands several times in the preceding decades. The relevant history was this. In the 1970s and early 1980s, the section of land near the eastern culvert had been part of an adjacent parcel, a smaller lot that had been purchased in 1973 by a man named Raymond Toll. Raymond Toll. The name appears nowhere in the original investigation. It was not in Marsh's files, not in the FBI files, not in any of the 11 suspect interviews. Raymond Toll had never been a person of interest in the disappearance of Annie Hartwell. He had not been interviewed because no one had thought to connect him to the park. He had no formal employment history at Disneyland. He had no criminal record in California as of 1975. He was, on the surface, an unremarkable man in his late 30s, originally from Northern California, no fixed employment, who had drifted through a series of short-term jobs. He had purchased a small parcel of land east of what would later become the Denton farm in late 1973, paying cash, and had constructed a modest outbuilding on the property where he appeared to have lived, intermittently, for a period of approximately 3 years. He had sold the property in 1978, again for cash, through a transaction that was legal but minimal in its paperwork, and had disappeared from the area. His name appeared in no county records after 1978. He had no known family in the region. He was, in the parlance of investigators who encounter this kind of vanishing, a ghost. But his name did appear in one other place. A theatrical supply company in Los Angeles, which had been interviewed back in 1975 in connection with the Mask inquiry, had records, imperfect, partial, but extant, of customers from that period. The investigator who reviewed those records in November 1990 found, in the company's handwritten ledger from the spring of 1975, a cash sale for a theatrical face mask, white-painted, clown-style, to a buyer whose first name was recorded only as paid in cash. No address recorded. It was not conclusive. It would never, in a court of law, have constituted proof. But it fit. It fit the way these things sometimes fit in cold cases, not with a click, like a key in a lock, but with a slow, heavy settling, like something that has been suspended a long time finally finding the ground. Investigators began working to reconstruct Raymond Toll's presence in the Anaheim area during the summer of 1975. They found, through the painstaking cross-referencing of various records, that he had attended Disneyland on at least 2 occasions that summer. His name appeared on visitor registration card from a promotional event in June 1975, during which the park had collected guest contact information. He had been there. He had been inside those gates. He had been watching. The former Disneyland employee who had come forward in late 1975 to report seeing a man walking the park without engaging in its attractions, watching children, was re-interviewed in 1990. He was in his 50s now, retired, and his memory was imperfect across 15 years. But he was shown a photograph of Raymond Toll, sourced from a California driver's license record from 1974, the most recent official image that could be located. He studied it for a long time. "I can't be certain," he said. But that could be him. The hair is right. The build is right. I can't be certain. But he put the photograph down. That could be him. Toll himself could not be found. A nationwide search of records under his name and several suspected aliases turned up nothing after 1978. He had either died, not impossibly, he would have been in his mid-50s by 1990, and men who live off the grid have high mortality rates, or he had become someone else. Or he had simply slipped through the particular cracks that exist in the paper trail of American life, for those who know how to navigate them. What investigators believe happened on July 19, 1975, reconstructed across 15 years and the evidence that remained. Raymond Toll had been inside the park that day. He had brought the mask, the theatrical, clown-style mask that he had purchased in the spring, possibly with this day in mind, possibly with days like this in mind. He had moved through the crowd, using the mask to appear as one of the park's many performers, A fiction that worked because it asked nothing unusual of the people around him. People see what they expect to see. They saw a clown among clowns, a performer among performers. No one questioned it. He had interacted with children throughout the day, learning the geography of the crowd, finding the right moment, finding the right child. Annie was alone for less than 30 seconds. He had been watching for that moment. He had known it would come. In a crowd of 40,000 people, with two adults briefly looking away, 30 seconds was enough. He had spoken to her, made her laugh. Donna Wexler heard the laughter. And Annie, who trusted joy because she had been raised in a world where joy was trustworthy, had gone with him. Not because she was foolish, because she was 6, and the world had not yet taught her that things wearing happy faces could be hiding something else entirely. He had left the park in the chaos of the crowd, in the brief window before exits were monitored. He had driven east. He had brought her to his land. Beyond that, investigators would not speculate officially. They did not need to, for the purposes of what they could establish. The suitcase had been buried on that land. The items inside it had been placed there by someone who had access to that land, who knew where the culvert was, who understood how to dig an earth that would hold a secret. And for 15 years, the earth had held it, until the rain came and the water rose and the ground, after so long, gave up what it had been keeping. What we carry. Patricia Hartwell was 53 years old when Detective Sandra Perez drove to Glendale to speak with her in November 1990. Robert was there as well. They sat together on the couch in their living room, the same couch, actually, that they'd had since the 1970s. Patricia had never wanted to replace it, and they listened to what Perez told them with the particular stillness of people who have spent 15 years preparing themselves for a version of this conversation and have found, now that it is happening, that they were not prepared at all. Perez was careful. She was honest, but she was careful. She told them what the investigation had established. She told them about the suitcase, about the items, about the mask and what Donna Wexler had confirmed. She told them about Raymond Toll, about the land, about the composite picture of events that investigators had assembled. She did not tell them everything, because some things could not be confirmed, and a detective who tells a family unconfirmed things is doing a different kind of damage in the name of closure. What she told them was enough. Patricia sat very still throughout. Her hands were folded in her lap. At one point, Robert reached over and took one of her hands in his, and she didn't move, but she didn't pull away. When Perez finished, there was a long silence. Then Patricia said, "Do you know where she is? Where she actually is?" Perez told her about the forensic examination of the land. She told her that the findings were consistent with human remains in the area near the culvert, that the earth had been disturbed at some point in the mid-1970s, that the ongoing examination was working to establish more. She told her that they had not yet confirmed identification with the certainty that she deserved, but that the work was continuing. Patricia nodded. She absorbed this the way she had absorbed everything over 15 years, with a practiced, terrible discipline of a woman who has learned to take information in carefully, to hold it without letting it break her open, because being broken open helps no one, least of all the child you are still, always, looking for. She was happy, Patricia said finally. That morning. She was so happy. It was not a question. It was not even really directed at Perez. It was something Patricia was saying to herself, something she was confirming, something she had told herself 10,000 times in 15 years and needed to say one more time out loud. "I know," Perez said quietly, even though she hadn't been there. She said it because it was true, and because some things need to be answered even when they are not quite questions. Robert did not speak for a long time. He stared at the middle distance, at something Perez couldn't see, and when he finally looked at her his eyes were dry. He had done his crying, it seemed, somewhere private, somewhere between getting the call that morning that she was coming and the moment she sat down in their living room. "Is the man still alive?" he asked. "We don't know," Perez told him. "We are still working to locate him." They would never locate Raymond Toll. The search continued, in various forms, for several more years. The name was circulated. Records were checked. Tips came in and were followed. None of them led anywhere definitive. Raymond Toll had vanished from the world as completely as if the earth had swallowed him too. And wherever that earth was, it gave nothing back. Gerald Marsh, retired, came out of retirement briefly to consult on the reopened case. He drove to Glendale and sat with Robert on the front porch one afternoon in December 1990. And they talked for 2 hours. And mostly what they talked about was not the case but other things. The neighborhood, the weather, the way the light in California in winter had a particular quality, thin and golden, that neither of them had ever quite gotten used to. Before he left, Marsh said, "I said I believed the truth would surface. I meant it." "I know you did," Robert said. "Is it enough?" Marsh asked. Robert thought about it for a long time. "No," he said honestly, "but it's something. It's something where there was nothing." Marsh nodded. He understood that. He drove home. The formal investigation continued through 1991. Identification of remains from the site near the culvert was attempted through the forensic methodologies available at the time, limited, in those pre-DNA database years, and not ultimately conclusive beyond what the contextual evidence strongly implied. The items in the suitcase, the dress, the shoe, the mask, were consistent with what was known of Annie's last day. The timing, the location, the known presence of Raymond Toll on that land during the relevant period, all of it pointed in the same direction, with a heavy, terrible weight of circumstantial evidence that has been assembled carefully and honestly. Annie Louise Hartwell was never officially declared found in the way the word is usually meant. The case file was updated. The evidence was catalogued. The investigation reached a point of probable conclusion without a courtroom, without a conviction, without the particular form of closure that justice systems are designed to provide. In 1993, Robert and Patricia visited the land near the culvert, now fully part of Earl Denton's farm. Earl had bought the adjacent parcel years earlier, and the old property line existed only in county records. Earl was there when they arrived, this quiet man with big hands who had made the phone call that changed everything. He had not expected them to come. He didn't quite know what to do when they appeared at his gate. Patricia shook his hand and thanked him. Earl said he hadn't done anything that anyone else wouldn't have done. Patricia said, "You called. You didn't just walk away. You called." Earl nodded slowly. He understood what she was saying. They stood for a while near the culvert. Not in ceremony, exactly. No flowers, no speeches. Just standing, the way people stand at the edges of things that are too large for the ordinary gestures. The field was green from recent rain. The culvert was just a culvert. The earth was just earth. But it was also where the story had ended, and also, in some impossible, contradictory way, where it had finally been told. There is a particular kind of grief that lives alongside the unanswered question. It is not the sharp grief of fresh loss, which is almost physical in its presence, which occupies the body. It is quieter than that. It settles in and becomes part of the architecture of a life, present in every room, visible in certain lights, invisible in others. You don't move through it. You move around it. You learn its dimensions. Robert Hartwell died in 2003, at 67, of a heart that had been carrying a great deal for a great many years. He and Patricia were still together. They had not resolved the grief, because some things cannot be resolved. But they had built a life around it, and the life was real, and there was love in it, even in the shadow of the thing they had lost. Patricia is still alive. She keeps a small framed photograph in her study. Annie on the carousel, head thrown back, braids flying, laughing at something just outside the frame. Something wonderful, probably. Something that in that moment was completely hers. The ceramic animals are still on the shelf in Annie's room. In their proper order. The order Annie arranged them in. The order that only Annie understood. Patricia never moved them. Somewhere out there, some version of Raymond Toll lived out the rest of his life, wherever, whoever he finally became. The world held that too, with its characteristic indifference, making no accounting for what is hidden in it. But the earth, in the end, kept its own records. And on an October morning in 1990, after 4 days of rain and 15 years of silence, a farmer put on his boots and walked out into the gray, waterlogged dawn. And the earth told him something. And he called. What do you think really happened that day? Was it planned from the beginning, or an opportunity seized in a single, terrible moment? Some crimes are random. Some are not. The difference matters more than we sometimes want to think. Annie Hartwell would have been in her 30s by 1990. She would have had a life, the full, unpredictable, irreplaceable kind that none of us can imagine in advance. She deserved that life the way all children deserve it, completely, automatically, without question. Remember her as she was in that photograph, head back, braids flying, laughing at something wonderful. That is who she was. That is enough. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you believe that the lost deserve to be remembered, subscribe so we can keep telling the stories that matter.